Hi, everyone. Let's talk more about data collection as part of this video. I recorded a video about frequency, duration, and latency data that I hope is helpful, but let's say the behavior is happening at a very high rate and you as a classroom teacher can't keep up with the data collection because you're also doing the million other jobs that teachers do on a daily basis. That behavior is happening 50, 55, 60 times a class period every hour approximately, and that's really tough to accurately, consistently collect data if you were also teaching, okay? Or that behavior, maybe it is a safety concern. Maybe we're looking at biting or another type of physical aggression, and it can be really tough to collect frequency or duration data because biting doesn't have a very clear starting and stopping point. So how can we collect frequency? It can be really tough to set and stop a stopwatch to do duration when you're concerned with maintaining your safety, the student safety, and the safety of their peers. So if the behavior has unclear starting and stopping point, it's happening at a really high frequency, or maybe it's a safety concern for whatever reason, frequency, duration, and or latency data are not viable options. Here's three types of data that I hope are helpful to you all. Okay, so substitutes for frequency data collection. Let's talk about partial interval recording and momentary time sampling. So as the name suggests, with partial interval recording, we are doing two things. First of all, we are dividing our class period, school day, into intervals or time periods. Okay, maybe it's 5-minute time periods, maybe it's 10-minute time periods. And the other part is if the behavior occurs for part of the interval, hence the name partial interval, we document the behavior as having occurred. So let's take biting, one of my least favorite behaviors to address. It's just a tough behavior to address. So let's take biting with partial interval. If we're using 5-minute intervals and there are no occurrences of biting within that first 5 minutes, we put a dash or a circle, a zero in that first interval, signifying that the behavior did not happen. You don't want to leave intervals blank because it makes it look like you forgot to collect data during that interval. Okay, then during our next 5-minute interval, that student engages in a biting behavior. Okay, it doesn't matter how long the behavior lasts or how many times it occurred. If it happens at all during the interval, we mark it as having occurred. Okay, so during that third 5-minute interval, the biting happens again. We mark it. You just mark it once. It doesn't matter if it happens part of the interval, the whole interval, once, twice, three times. You just mark it one time. So partial interval, if the behavior happens for part of intervals, you mark the behavior as having occurred. Okay, a great substitute for frequency data collection. Another type that we can do similar is momentary time sampling. Okay, so the big difference between momentary time sampling and partial interval is we're still dividing that observation session, whether it's a class period or a day, into time intervals. The only difference is we're not collecting data based on behaviors that happen during the interval. We're just looking at the end of the interval if that behavior happens. So let's take cell phone use. Okay, and we start at 9 o'clock and we have 5-minute intervals. 9:05 rolls around. Is the student on their cell phone at that time? It doesn't matter what they were doing between 9:01 and 9:04. We're just looking at 9:05. Are they on their phone? If the answer is yes, we mark the interval. If the answer is no, hyphen or a zero goes in that interval. Same thing 5 minutes later if we're using 5-minute intervals. 9:10 rolls along. Are they on their phone? No. Okay. So it's a hyphen or a zero. Yes, we put an X in their interval. So momentary time sampling, think moment. Does it happen at the moment the interval ends? If the answer is yes, you mark it as having happened. If the answer is no, you mark it as not having happened. Okay. If you're thinking, well, what do I do if I'm collecting duration data, but I just can't keep up because it's a behavior that maybe it is unsafe? Okay. Whole interval is a substitute to duration. You can also use it for measuring progress towards desired behaviors like remaining in assigned areas, participation during cooperative learning opportunities, engagement during independent seatwork activities, right? So with whole interval recording, if you're thinking, well, is this kind of like partial interval, but with whole interval, the behavior has to happen the entire interval? The answer is yes. Okay, so again, interval, just like with partial and momentary time sampling, maybe it's 5-minute intervals. Does a behavior last the whole interval? If the answer is yes, we mark the behavior as having happened. If the answer is no, doesn't matter if it's 5-minute intervals and that behavior happens 4 minutes, 55 seconds, we still mark the behavior as not having occurred. The behavior has to last the entire interval, hence the name whole interval recording. So if we're looking at participation during cooperative learning and that student is participating the entire 5-minute interval, at the end of that interval, we mark the behavior as yes, it occurred. Okay, that next 5-minute interval, maybe the first 4 minutes and 50 seconds they're participating, the last 10 seconds they get up and leave the room without permission. Okay, we put a hyphen or a zero in that interval because it did not last the whole interval the entire time. So that's whole interval. So think partial interval, momentary time sampling, great substitutes for frequency data collection. Whole interval, a great substitute for duration data collection. The one thing I want to caution you all is if you are collecting data using partial and whole interval recording, and every single box of behavior is marked as an X having happened, or a zero or a hyphen saying the behavior did not happen, you might be thinking, well, how do I use that data? I agree that's not necessarily the most helpful. It looks like the behavior is either always happening or never happening. What you need to do in these situations is shorten time intervals to get more precise data. Okay, with data collection, we're always balancing precision with feasibility. Okay, so while partial momentary time sampling and whole interval might not be quite as accurate as frequency, duration, latency, they might be more practical and feasible and thus better suited for your needs as a classroom teacher working with students who exhibit challenging behaviors.